Hello, good evening. If everybody could take their seats, we'd appreciate it. We can get this show on the road. Well, good evening. Wow, this is really impressive. What a crowd. As you know, this lecture is being offered in collaboration and with support of the Touro Synagogue Foundation. As always, I welcome our museum members and prospective members to the second lecture for the season. I'm Deanna Canini, president of the Museum of Newport Irish History. I want to recognize our board members. Could I ask you all to stand? I think we have a number of them here. Please, I just want you to, each one is so critical to the mission of the museum, organizing the lecture series, maintaining the Bonnie Street Cemetery, managing the Interpretive Center, our museum site, fundraising, communicating to our members and the public, keeping our financials and reporting in order, and keeping the museum current and involved. So I want to thank them. Please. You didn't stay. Oh, okay. I also want to welcome the members of the Touro Synagogue Foundation Board, especially Rita Sloan, a long time supporter, I have to say, and contributed to the museum. Thanks also to the foundation's board chair, Laura Friedman, and director, Merle Corley. In addition to our many museum members in attendance via Zoom, we have many supporters of the foundation and members of the congregation Jeshua Israel joining us. We also have many of our past speakers in attendance: Don Quinn, Scott Malloy, Steve Marino, Janet Nolan, Evelyn Stearns, Kurt Schlichting, Sean O'Callahan, and then via Zoom, we have Margaret Lynch Brennan and Maureen Brady. So very impressive turnout of people. To keep you informed of what's going on with the museum, we have a couple events coming up. The next lecture is scheduled for November 20th with Dr. Marian Matheson Desrosiers, who is here somewhere. She's over there. So you'll see her on November 20th. Our Celtic Team in Newport is the title of her speak. I think many of you probably received the flyer today. Then our Christmas open house at the Interpretive Center will be on December 14th, noon to 4:30. Please stop by, visit the museum, share in some seasonal goodies, and hear the AOH singers, men singers. Maybe some women will be in there too, I think. Anyway, please check these out, these happenings on the website under the events tab. The Interpretive Center season is now completed. Our great docents, the Danforths, closed our Interpretive Center yesterday with a great Halloween bash, I understand. And we did have a successful season with many interesting guests over the season. As you know, through your support and grants we've received, we're moving into the digital age. I've mentioned it before. Mike's Lane, busy converting our walking tours, and then we're bringing the digital display, a digital display to the Interpretive Center to enhance our stories. And soon, you'll be receiving information on the Luck of the Irish raffle. It's coming up in November. Now to the main event. Excuse me. Our lecturer tonight is Dr. Hasia-Opening, Professor Emerita, New York University, where she was the Paul S. and Sylvia Steinberg Professor of American Jewish History with a joint appointment in the History Department and the Department of Hebrew and Judaic Studies. She serves as the interim director of NYU's Glucksman Ireland House. Dr. Dinah has been a scholar of American Jewish history, American immigration history, the history of American women, and Irish American history, all of which were the subject of books that she has written. A recipient of both the Fulbright Award and a Guggenheim Fellowship, she's the author of numerous books, two of which won National Jewish Book Awards. This evening, Dr. Dinah will speak, and Mr. Dan Snydecker will assist in leading a discussion with us. Mr. Snydecker has been the executive director of the Newport Historical Society and serves as on the Touro Synagogue Foundation Board as chair of the Education Committee. Also, Dr. Dinah's new book, Opening Doors, will be available in the back after the discussion for signing, and that's per the Charter Books is here with us. So now, please join me in welcoming Dr. Dinah and Mr. Snydecker. Now, the unlucky alliance between the Irish and Jews in America. Thank you.
Okay, I hope you'll bear with me speak. Can you hear me? Okay, I hope you'll bear with me speaking from a seated position. I'm obviously fine, but I had surgery last month, and so I'm a little wary of standing too long. So I think this makes it even more homey. And well, it's kind of hard to be homey with such an enormous audience. I will do my best, and I really want to thank everybody, Ann Arnold, in particular, who was the connector to bring me here. So let me begin. So a songwriting duo who churned out many, many songs on New York's Tin Pan Alley in the early 20th century. William Jerome, born William Flannery, of Irish immigrant parents, and Jean Schwartz, a Jewish immigrant from Hungary, produced in 1912 a lighthearted, but however, kind of historically significant song. It was entitled "If It Wasn't for the Irish and the Jews." Okay, and I can assure you, I am not going to sing it. You wouldn't want that. You would drive me off the stage. But it was a piece, however silly it was, that packed an enormous punch. In the song, America, which they call Yankee Land, okay, was the only place where this duo, Schwartz and Jerome, could come together and make music. Along with many other Irish and Jews, they, as the song tells us, drove away the blues, and according to the lyrics, helped transform the little USA into a real democracy. So let me quote a bit from the song. And it's if you can probably get it on YouTube, it was actually discovered by my late colleague, Mick Maloney. Okay, so the song. I just returned from Europe. I've seen London and Paris. I'm so glad to be back home in Yankee Land. In fact, the little USA looks better to me. It's a real place that I know that folks understand. But still, I often think what this country would be if we hadn't had men like Rosenstein and Hughes. Okay, we'd surely have a kingdom, but there'd be no democracy if it wasn't for the Irish and the Jews. Okay, just to get a little bit, it's a kind of long song. What would this great Yankee nation really look like? Would ever do if it wasn't for a Levy, a Monahan, or a Donahue? Where would we get our policemen? Well, Uncle Sam would have the blues. Without the Pats and Isidores, there'd be no big department stores if it wasn't for the Irish and the Jews. Okay, let me just get to the last verse. Again, it's pretty long. Talk about a combination, heed my words and make a note. On St. Patrick's Day, Rosinski pins a shamrock on his coat. There's a sympathetic feeling between the Blooms and McAdoos. Why Tammany, who's going to play, by the way, a big part in my talk, while Tammany would surely fall. In fact, there'd be no hall at all if it wasn't for the Irish and the Jews. So the song, recorded at multiple times and sold both as gramophone records and as sheet music, offers a clever starting point to think about the alchemy that developed when Irish Catholics and Jewish immigrants, along with their descendants, worked together in urban America, and in the process, how they remade the nation. The history of the United States was shaped in part by the arrival, as I don't have to tell all the members of the Irish Museum, about the arrival of millions of Catholic women and men from Ireland starting in the late 1840s, and the 3 million or so Jews from Eastern Europe, both of whom arrived as permanent immigrants. The numbers and their participation in the labor force alone make them important actors in American history. But so too does their involvement with politics, the labor movement, public education, popular culture, where Jerome and Schwartz met and wrote their silly song. These changed their new adopted land. Upon arrival, these largely working class individuals who had no choice but to come to terms with the reality that although capable as white men of becoming citizens, as religious outsiders, they confronted a deeply Protestant, militantly, in fact, American public, which defined America as its, not theirs. Okay, Irish Catholics in the mid-19th century were urban, permanent, working class, heavily female, met fierce opposition in the particular hostility of the Protestant majority, which worried about that its power and its right to define the nation was being taken away by these brutish, stupid, drunken newcomers. Over the course of the post-Civil War decades, the immigrants, their sons and daughters, made a visible place for themselves in American society and gave American cities their politics, their labor force, their labor unions, their public entertainment, and a range of institutions, religious, educational, cultural, benevolent, that served as the backbones of their communities. Okay, the large East European Jewish migration essentially picks up in the 1870s, and while much smaller in number than the Irish, they too concentrated in a few cities, New York in particular, and this population centered in the garment industry and various forms of petty entrepreneurship also transformed their new home. Like the Irish, they had no intention of going back, and they went about the process of building community institutions from the ground up. They never agreed among themselves as to what those institutions should look like, and were always at odds with each other. They confronted the fact that the American ethos defined itself as a Christian nation. And despite the guarantees of the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, they, like their Irish peers, were in constant confrontation with individuals, institutions, and practices that reified that Protestant understanding of America as not a natural home for the Jews, or in fact, the Irish. So Irish and Jews met each other primarily in American cities. They met each other in informal places, on street corners, in the hallways of the apartment buildings where they lived, in shops and on the stoops of the tenements, and so on. But they also bumped into each other in some much more formal places, classrooms, in labor union meeting halls, and in the smoke-filled back room of various political organizations like New York's Tammany Hall. They came together and transformed the little USA and drove away the blues, not because they believed in an ideology of cultural pluralism, what we might now call multiculturalism. Neither the Irish or the Jews purposely sought each other out as allies or partners in some kind of abstract sense. And certainly they had no desire to break down the social, cultural, certainly religious boundaries which divided them. Each remained deeply committed to their communities and their tradition, but they figured they had something to offer each other. And in that process of discovery, they realized they needed each other. And in that process where they discovered that they needed each other, the Irish served as the role models and guides for the Jews. So what I want to do in this talk is to explore a few of those meeting places where, for practical purposes, they came together and consciously or not consciously mounted an assault against the native-born white Protestant elite, which demonized them and tried to hold them back. So in this talk, I give top billing to the Irish. Okay, and I should say that the title of the book, when I finally sent it to the publisher, was Opening Doors: How the Irish Taught the Jews to Become American. Okay, which is the point of the talk. The editor did not like that, so it's okay. Maybe theirs is better. So again, I give top billing to the Irish, whether immigrants or American born. The former arrival or early arrivals to the United States with their massive numbers truly threw Protestant America into a panic. Okay, they then played the role of teachers to the Jews. They functioned as the guides and at times defenders of the Jews who immigrated later and in decidedly smaller number in proportion to the white Christian population. Now, I do need to pause for a moment and say, without, I know, aggrandizing myself, which I guess we all do, this goes against the grain of the historical scholarship as it exists. When other historians have thought about the Irish-Jewish connection in America, unlike those songwriters from 1912, they dwelt on the existence of anti-Semitism among the Irish. They referred to and just keep mentioning low levels of constant street violence perpetrated by thuggish Irish gangs, usually almost always young men who preyed on hapless victims. Those histories have also quoted at random from articles in some Irish newspapers, sermons delivered by Irish priests who thundered to their parishioners about the eternal guilt of the Jews, the Christ killers, guilty of the crucifixion. The rantings of Father Charles Coughlin, the flamboyant radio priest, who through his broadcasts reached about 40 million, it was estimated, listeners a week in the 1930s, bombarded the American public with a barrage of anti-Jewish words, probably without parallel in the history of the United States. His constant references to the power of the international Jewish conspiracy and his adulation for Hitler clearly falls into that category that we can call anti-Semitism. One of his broadcasts right after Kristallnacht was "Wait till Hitler comes to America." Okay, another Irish Catholic priest a decade later, Father Leonard Feeney in the late 1940s, regularly climbed onto a soapbox in the Boston Common and carried on about the evils of the Jews. So often and so loudly did he carry on these diatribes against the Sheenies that people mocked him as Sheeny Feeney. Okay, now, the other side of the equation, which has gotten almost no attention, and again, I hope you'll read about it in the book, how American Jews viewed their Irish neighbors and fellow citizens has received very little attention, but I can tell you that Jews in America easily partook of anti-Irish rhetoric promulgated by the white Protestant Yankees. Their newspapers were full of cartoons of ugly Irish men and women, jokes about drinking and stupidity filled the Jewish press. But as I've made clear, I want to do something very different, and I want to look at the ways in which individuals either born in Ireland or the descendants of Irish immigrants help pave the way for the Jews, and how and why the Jews turned to them, and why they opened the doors and lent a hand. Okay, now let me just offer a few examples and each one a kind of distinctive way in which this kind of interplay worked itself out. So from the middle of the 19th century on, Jews turned to Irish American women and men to help them in their American project. In moments of crisis, Jews in need of mouthpieces and allies, of defenders to argue their larger case, considered Irish Americans as the ideal individuals to fit the bill and take up their cause. In Boston, Rabbi Solomon Schindler, for example, did this in collaboration with the two editors of the local Catholic newspaper, the Boston Pilot, John Boyle O'Reilly and his successor, Jeffrey Roach. Schindler considered that these two would be able to assist him in his effort to defend the Jews against defamation locally, nationally, and internationally. Roach and O'Reilly exposed and condemned local, national, and international instances of anti-Semitism. They pointedly used their columns in the Boston Pilot to ferret out anti-Semitism and land-based actions taken against the Jews, particularly by the local Boston Protestant elite, the Brahmins. Okay, and they seem to take particular pride in when anti-Semitic incidents took place at Harvard, because here's the bastion of the Brahmins, and they are showing their true colors as anti-Semites. So too in New York in 1893, as anti-immigrant and anti-Jewish rhetoric escalated, a group of Jewish notables, newspaper editor Philip Cowan and attorney Max Kohler, turned to an individual, Charles P. Daly, born in County Galway, who then sat as the Chief Justice of the New York Court of Common Pleas, and who was also president of the Ancient Order of Hibernians, to plead the case of the Jews. Daly wrote the first history of the Jews of the United States. It's kind of remarkable that of all the books written of this enormous literature in American Jewish history, it begins with Charles P. Daly. Daly's book, The Settlement of the Jews in North America, was a rousing tribute to the Jews. He said, "There's no finer class of citizens we have ever seen." In his work, Daly showed that the Jews had, as no Jew before him had, that they had been present in America since the 17th century, and could hardly be considered aliens or foreigners. That year, Daly also published a small book called The Jews of New York, and again demonstrated that the Jews had been there since the middle of the 17th century. They were an integral part of the life of the city. They took care of their own poor, and they contributed much to the common good. The reliance of Jewish individuals the Jewish reliance on the Irish individuals to act in their behalf extended into the early 20th century and well into the 1920s, and it played itself out on the international stage as well. In the aftermath of the murderous pogrom in Kishinev in April 1903, the Irish nationalist and globe-trotting journalist Michael Davitt went to the Moldavian city of Kishinev to investigate what had happened to the Jews, why, and how. Davitt, in his newspaper articles, pondered the implications of the horrendous attack on the Jews, declaring to his readers that given this level of the violence, the Jews could not remain in Russia, and that immigration to America had to be able to continue, and America was the best hope for the Jewish people. Now, Davitt had gone to Kishinev as a reporter for the Hearst newspapers, but upon his arrival, a group of well-placed American Jews turned to him. They urged Davitt to take all of his articles and to put them in a single book. Here he was, a highly identified Irish nationalist, and they believed he would be the best one to inform the public about the outrages against the Jews and to stint, they told him, no bloody details. The Jewish Publication Society of America then secured Davitt's permission to publish this book called Within the Pale, The True Story of Anti-Semitic Persecution in Russia. So this is the first book published in the United States about the pogroms, written by an Irish nationalist. Okay, as the Jewish leaders saw it, okay, he could do something they couldn't do. Besides the fact that he had been there, but he could argue the case of the Jews and not be accused of self-interest. He could speak without being viewed as just arguing his own case, but rather as with his Irish bona fides, the fact of his not being a Jewish, and as a bearer of a reputation of a journalist, he could do what the Jews could not. I just want to offer a final little example of this arguing for the Irish, arguing for the case of the Jews. In the 1920s, the Knights of Columbus, seeing the vast rise of anti-immigrant sentiment, anti-Jewish and anti-Catholic, okay, in the personage of the Ku Klux Klan, the Knights of Columbus created a book series called The Racial Contribution to American Society. And there was a book there were several books. It never became the vast library that the Knights of Columbus wanted, but one book was The Jewish Contribution to American Civilization. Okay, they found a Jewish writer to write this book. So the book would have never seen the light of day without the Knights of Columbus. So here we go from John Boyle O'Reilly to the Knights of Columbus. Now, the Jewish, Irish-Jewish connection, the cross-ethnic mentorship, mostly took place, though, on very local settings, on local ground. And indeed, the song that I began with declared that in the matter of urban politics in America, the Irish-Jewish combination mattered. If it weren't for the Irish and the Jews, the song said, there's a sympathetic feeling between the Blooms and McAdoos, and Tammany Hall would surely fall. And why there'd be no hall at all if it wasn't for the Irish and the Jews. So Jews coming to America, settling for the most part in its largest cities, New York and in particular, but Chicago, Boston, Rochester, Albany, Providence, Worcester, Springfield, and so on, entered a realm dominated by Irishmen. Urban politics was Irish politics. Irish men from the street corner on up dominated the playing of politics in American cities. Now, historians have certainly tried their hand to figure out why that happened, and that's on some level not so important, at least to me. What is important to me is that they saw the advantage in using their political position, running the cities from the bottom up to the advantage of the Jews. Now, for the Jews, this represented a startlingly revolutionary moment in their history. Mostly they arrived in America with, for one thing, they hadn't been citizens in the places they left. They weren't qualified for citizenship, and many of those places, in fact, didn't have citizenship. They had no experience in the rough and tumble of coalition politics. They had never been partners in that political dance of being wooed and courted and appealed to by non-Jews, non-Jewish politicians who only wanted one thing out of them, their vote. Okay, and maybe a second thing, which is to get your neighbor to vote for us as well. In every city to which they went, New York at the top of the heap, Jewish men encountered Irish politicians ranging from operatives who worked in every tenement building and on the street corners and all the way up the rungs of the political ladder, men who wanted them, lusted after their votes, and would kind of do almost anything for them to get that vote. So Irish political operatives showed up at Jewish weddings and funerals, at bar mitzvah ceremonies, at synagogue dedications, at meetings of B'nai B'rith lodges and of Landsmannschaften. These were hometown societies of from people from various towns, particularly in Poland, to reach out to Jewish voters. One of the Irish kind of really colorful Tammany politicians, Big Tim Sullivan, had a table in the vestibule of Beis HaMedrash HaGadol. Or somebody working for him every Monday and Thursday to listen to the complaints of of the men who came to worship. Okay, and he obviously figured out Monday and Thursdays were the days the Torah was read. So men coming out of morning services, there would see Big Tim at a table, shaking their hand, and what can I do for you? Okay, one of the best sources I saw were the day books of a New York politician named Johnny Ahern, who was eventually Manhattan Borough president, I think a few stints in prison for some kind of corruption. But Johnny's day books were filled with letters either to him or which he wrote on behalf of Jewish constituents. So to the head of the prison, the prison system, he said, my constituent, Mrs. Abramowitz, has a son in the Tombs. Could you give him a furlough for the upcoming holidays? He got them contracts. He got them jobs. He showed up at he bought tickets to the galas of the Jewish orphanages and Jewish old age societies. And in one letter for the Kosher Poultry Association, which was in a dispute with the Jefferson Market, he said, I'll go and represent you. Okay, so there's Johnny Ahern, born in Ireland, doing what the Jews needed because the Jews had what he needed, their votes. So Tammany Hall and its equivalents in New York and Boston and elsewhere translated their campaign posters and flyers into Yiddish. And indeed, Tammany Hall in the early 19th century provided the funds to launch one of the first Yiddish newspapers in America, okay, Der Wahrheit. And while I am sure Tammany Hall wasn't interested in the creation of a Yiddish literary and journalistic culture in America, the newspaper served as a vehicle for Tammany, and it added to the literary culture of the neighborhood. So as one commentator noted about Tammany in 1893, Tammany knows no race or creed when it's a question of acquiring or preserving political power. Some of its election captains are Jewish. While George Washington Plunkett, the Irish-born Tammany Hall boss, described in a little lecture he gave on being a boss and what the machine means. He said on a typical day, he attended a Jewish funeral, a Jewish confirmation ceremony, and a Jewish wedding. He noted that he always sat in the front of the synagogue, okay, so that so much better to be seen by these potential voters. So again, this was no manifestation of cross-ethnic solidarity, but rather Tammany and its counterparts in Boston, Buffalo, Albany, New Haven, Pittsburgh, Chicago, St. Louis reflected hard-nosed political canny. Jewish men had what it took by the Irish politicos to help stay in power. They had votes. With no desire or even ability to go back, Jews nearly all, and again, first it's men, later on women, had the ability to become naturalized, acquire citizenship, and they turned out, and by the way, Tammany Hall ran citizenship classes, okay, in the Jewish neighborhoods. Okay, and they kept track of who was getting their citizenship and then made sure they came out on election day. Okay, so as the Irish machine workers saw it, it was better to appoint Jews to visible positions in the party's apparatus, give them jobs in campaigns, get them contracts, appoint them to office in city government, even put them on the ballot so that they had their votes. And in return, the Jews got their steps into mobility and political activism in America. So as Jews ward by ward, city by city, got their first steps upward in American urban politics, they had whatever they did. And in the 1940s and 50s, it's a lot about Jewish outreach to Black and Puerto Rican voters in New York. They worked by an Irish playbook. That's where they learned what to do. Now, the Irish, as political examples for the Jews, also had a kind of focus beyond the local. American Zionists who labored to bring about a Jewish homeland in Palestine starting in the 1890s admired, paid homage to, and listened to the words and ideas and studied the tactics of Irish American nationalist politics in order to sustain their struggle for national liberation back home. Now, Zionists were a very small part of the American political landscape until the 1930s and 1940s. And those few individuals who were involved in national and Zionism were constantly kind of pulling their hair out because they couldn't get anybody to come to their meetings, join their organizations, pay dues, and carry on this work. And while they lamented their own inability to bring people out, they looked at what they saw as the zeal of their Irish neighbors for the cause of Irish nationalism, seeing the Irish around them as ultra dedicated men and women willing to work, march, and contribute money to the cause of shaking off British rule. American Zionists in their writings and in their oratory resounded for admiration, and I would actually call it jealousy, of the Irish who seemed to be able to mobilize the masses. So many quotes on this. I'm just going to give a couple. A young attorney living in Springfield, Massachusetts, Abraham Camberg, declared in an article very directly, the Irish race has taught us the value and the benefit to be derived from organizing for united action, be it political or otherwise. A clear jab at what he saw as the disunity of American Jews. A 1916 article in a Yiddish newspaper, the Yiddish Tagblatt, written by a correspondent from Cincinnati, urged the paper's readers to pay attention to the uncompromising devotion of the Irish to their cause. Okay, quote, the Irish as a whole are interested in every way and detail of the home rule movement. They are all in favor of it, which was probably not true. Okay, but to these Jews, what the Irish could accomplish seemed amazing. Okay, and just one more quote. This is from the late 19 teens. No more fervent and devoted nationalists exist today than those of Americans of Irish extraction. We cannot take up a newspaper without being convinced that the thoughts of Irish Americans are constantly occupied with the interests of the country from which they came. And it was probably overstated, far exaggerated, but to the Jews, the Irish had figured out how to do it, and they had to learn from them. Now, yet another zone of encounter where Jews learned from the Irish took place in the field of labor organizing. The Jewish immigrants who came to the United States starting in the 1870s streamed into the sweatshops and then garment factories of New York and other large cities, where they faced oppressive working conditions, impeding their quest for economic security, and which frankly violated their dignity. They very slowly embraced unionization. Their labor organizations founded, particularly the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, founded in 1900, and the Amalgamated Clothing Workers Union, organized in 1914, served as potent weapons in securing better working conditions, higher wages, making it possible so that their children would never go to work in those factories. But Jews came to the United States with no tradition of labor organizing, had no idea how to do this. There was one union founded in Vilna in 1897, the Bund, but it was illegal. The leadership and the membership of the Bund could not meet in public. They couldn't print newspapers. They couldn't speak, all via the Tsarist regime. So they had no idea of how to do this kind of on the ground organizing. And what organizing the Bund did was only the Bund, the Jewish Workers' Bund, organizing Jewish workers, which was not how American factories worked. American factories were full of all sorts of other people, Italian, Polish, and so on. So those Jews who wanted to organize unions had to figure out how to speak not only to their own people, but to others as well. They entered America, that did not embrace the idea of workers organizing and demanding concessions from their employers. But organizing had begun, first with the Knights of Labor, and then the American Federation of Labor, among others. And they had scored some victories. And by and large, their leadership and their rank and file was all Irish. Okay, that's who made up the Knights of Labor. That's who made up the AFL. Men like Peter O'Brien and Peter McGuire, who founded the AFL and gave us Labor Day, Terence Powderly, the leader of the Knights of Labor, they all took on Jewish students, that is Jewish workers, who wanted to find out the secret of how to organize. A young man by the name of Sidney Hillman was working in the men's clothing industry in Chicago, and he wanted to organize a union. He didn't like the one that existed. And to learn how to do this, he went to John Fitzpatrick, the head of the Chicago Federation of Labor, and asked him, how do I do it? How does one organize a union? And Fitzpatrick gave him some good advice, and then said, I'm going to send you to Agnes Nestor, who founded the Glove Makers Union. She'll really show you what to do. And daughter of Irish immigrants, in her memoir, she writes, Can you believe I taught Sidney Hillman how to organize? Hillman goes on to become a close confidant of FDR. And indeed, the word in the 1930s during the New Deal was that whenever there was a labor question, Roosevelt would say, clear it with Sidney. Now, there would have been no Sidney, but for Agnes Nestor and John Fitzpatrick. Jewish women, labor leaders, also learned very well the tools of unionization from the Irish women who preceded them. And again, it's one of the really interesting kind of connections is that Jewish women and Irish women had the highest rates of labor, of membership in unions as rank and file, as well as leadership. Okay, so these Irish women who made up, many of whom came through the ranks from the Knights of Labor, tutored Jewish women on how to go about their work. So a young woman in the early 20th century, Rose Schneiderman from Lithuania, fell under the spell of Leonora O'Reilly, okay, who showed her in her fiery speeches and in her political acumen that the conditions of labor and the limitations endured by women could not be disassociated. They needed to be conquered together. So Pauline Newman, Bessie Abramowitz, Molly Sheps, Lillian Herstein, Rose Schneiderman learned directly from Leonora O'Reilly and Mary Kenny O'Sullivan, and so many more who had cut their teeth on the Knights of Labor and knew what to do and passed that on to their Jewish sisters. The Jewish women did with what they did, and they were a very powerful part of the American labor movement. They did this certainly on their own intellect and drive, but they couldn't have done it without that tutelage that came of the women who had come before them, all Irish. Okay, there's nobody else in that formula. Okay, and then the last zone where the duo of Irish teacher and Jewish student was transformative of people and transformative of American society literally took place in classrooms. In New York in particular, but Chicago, Boston, and others, those happen to be the cities I studied, when Jewish immigrants disembarked at Castle Garden and then after 1892 at Ellis Island, their children who had been born abroad went directly into American classrooms, where more likely than not, they met school teachers, women who themselves or their parents had been born in Ireland. Okay, the hundreds of thousands, in fact, millions of Jewish children born in America to immigrant parents also took some of their most profound American lessons from Irish women who staffed the city's public schools. These schools provided crucial settings for in which Irish Americans taught Jewish children, literally how to become American. Now, American Jewish writing has placed much emphasis on education and taking great pride in the swift movement of Jewish boys and girls from their immigrant journeys in steerage to the American middle class. And they've celebrated public education as the engine that made that possible. But those engines needed engineers. And the engineers were the legions of American, mostly Irish women who served as the guides to the language and details of American culture and to the basics of reading, writing, arithmetic, and beyond. In New York, Chicago, Boston, Providence, Worcester, these were Irish women. The Jewish children of the sweatshop workers and the factory laborers and the pushcart operators sat behind their desks year after year, facing teachers, women whose mothers and fathers had been born in Ireland. By the latter part of the 19th century, Irish American women made up the backbone of those cities' teaching forces. The job offered important and honorable work, steady employment, clean working conditions, and reasonable pay for a woman at a time when there were very few jobs that women could hold. In the big cities, most teachers got their jobs through the political machine. Okay, so there's a kind of pipeline from those Irish ward bosses to the schoolrooms, and Irish men handed out jobs to the daughters of their pals, their fellow Irish men. So these women served on the front lines, exposing the newly arrived Jewish immigrant children, literally what it meant to be American. They showed them by their dress, by their hairdos, okay, by their speech, by their comportment, the ideal of middle-class American life. It mattered little that these women were the daughters of working class Irish immigrants. Many of their mothers had been domestic servants. They became the models of what an American looked like to these Jewish children. To the Jewish children, immigrant children, fresh from Lithuania, Latvia, Ukraine, Belarus, Galicia, Romania, and elsewhere in Eastern and Central Europe, and to their awestruck parents who knew no English, these women represented American culture. Okay, they led the Jewish children in the Pledge of Allegiance. They taught them to sing patriotic hymns and inform these very new American youngsters about Thanksgiving, Lincoln's birthday, Washington's birthday. They didn't know any of these things. I mean, why would they have known these before? As they also drilled them in spelling and times tables and pointed out the crucial dates in the history of their adopted home. These women emphasized diction. It's very interesting how much this was about speech, learning how to sound American. They emphasized diction, often using poetry and oratory to get the children to sound American. Interestingly, many of the memoirs emphasize how the teachers use the poems of Longfellow as the kind of template from which the children should get up and learn how to speak. These Irish American women functioned as key players in the project of immigrant integration, with the Jewish children entering these American classrooms with no English at their command, yet expected by their parents to master the skills of American life. These boys and girls, in fact, had very high rates of school attendance through high school, and they attended public schools, with Jewish parochial schools nearly unheard of. Now, I'm going to look for very briefly at one woman, Myra Kelly, who we just happen to know a lot about. She was born in Dublin. She came to the United States with her father in the late 19th century. He happened to be a physician, and he established a medical practice in the Lower East Side in the Jewish immigrant neighborhood, which in and of itself is really fascinating. And while she herself hailed from a pretty privileged background, like many Irish American women, she became a public school teacher, and she worked at public schools in the Jewish enclave, particularly Public School 147, which was in the heart of the Jewish neighborhood. Now, we know about Myra Kelly because at some point she left the classroom and became a writer. And she wrote for magazines, and she wrote a number of novels based on her years as a teacher. Her protagonist is Miss Bailey, who teaches Russian Jewish children the intricacies and puzzles of American life. She loves the students, they love her. She loves their parents, they love her back. Her sweet tales, it doesn't matter if they're accurate or not, offers a small window into a very large and important historical phenomenon, the meeting of Irish Americans literally as teachers and the Jews who learned from them. Now, this story continues into the 1920s. By the 1920s, the daughters of Jewish immigrants themselves began to enter into the field of school teaching. And here they encountered Irish women as the principals who managed the schools, who served as the monitors of the licensing exams, and the supervisors in the school bureaucracy. So again, the relationship continues. To become a teacher, one had to attend normal school or some kind of teacher training school. The one in New York, most famous, was the Maxwell training school in Brooklyn. And that one young Jewish woman who attended the Maxwell School, left us the following memoir of her encounter with her Irish American teachers. These are now, the seasoned veterans who taught new women how to become teachers. So this woman, as part of an immigrant history, noted that all of her teachers were Irish. Okay, all of them had mothers who had been domestic servants in the city's finest homes. Okay, that's from her quote. And according to this informant, the Maxwell educators had learned from their mothers, one-time Irish servant girls, the quote, oh so proper manners, and they tried to teach them to us. In the spirit of noblesse, We, meaning the Jewish girls, the Jewish students at Maxwell, quote, were forever invited to their genteel tea parties. And the next line I just absolutely adore. I said, we who drank black tea from a glass at home were taught to lift our pinkies like our teachers did while using fine china. The instructors, okay, were telling us that to be a teacher meant to be a lady, and we should learn to be a lady by emulating them. Okay, now if there's a little kind of resentment at the bottom of that, is less important that these Irish teachers consider, or these Irish American teachers considered they had a job, they had a responsibility, indeed a mission to raise the next crop of school teachers. So leadership, teaching strategies, and even proper tea drinking etiquette flowed from the Irish to the Jews. Now, one final setting, and then I'm going to draw this to a close, at which Jews gained access to America by means of Irish teachers, took place at a range of Catholic universities, which opened their doors to Jewish students. At universities like Notre Dame, obviously the Fighting Irish, Fordham, St. John's, Georgetown, Creighton in Omaha, Providence College, Loyola and DePaul of Chicago, in particularly the professional schools, particularly law, medicine, pharmacy, business administration, and dentistry became in the 1920s safe spaces for Jewish aspirants to professional training. As private, non-Catholic professional schools erected quotas against Jewish students. I mean, literally would say we'll only take so many and so many students to our law school, so many and so many Jewish students to our pharmacy school, and so on. The Catholic universities, all with Irish founders, Irish administrators, faculty as trustees and the like, literally opened their doors. There were some undergraduates as well, but the real story took place in these professional schools, and schools which had no obligation to take Jewish students, but took them nonetheless. For some of these schools, shareholders, the admissions of Jewish students, nearly all men, although there's some women who attended Fordham and St. John's, may have grown out of some ideological commitment to interfaith cooperation and cross-religious dialogue, but mostly they saw Jewish students serving utilitarian purposes, mainly admit students who could pay, but by admitting students who could pay who were not Catholic or were not Christian, they were able to rhetorically or symbolically say to all the private universities around the country of Protestant background, you're keeping Jews out, we're letting them in. You're the bigots, we're not. We are the open-minded. Okay, I can only, there are so many statistics on this, and I'm certainly not going to recite them all, but I'll just say that at Fordham's Law School, as early as the 1910s, 20% of the students were Jewish. By the 1930s, it was almost half. Okay, the pharmacy school was about 60% Jewish and actually had a Jewish dean. Okay, and when a administrator or an official of the Jesuit order was making a trip around the world looking at Jesuit colleges and universities, he told Fordham, you have to let that dean go, so we can't have a Jewish dean at a Catholic university. And the president of Fordham, with a very Irish last name, say, he's our best dean, we're not getting rid of him. Okay, so too St. John's in Brooklyn, page after page of the pharmacy school yearbook and the business school yearbook and the law school yearbook were full of pictures and the names of Jewish students. Okay, so beyond the realm of the obvious, I mean, these students paid tuition. Some of them, when they finished, became loyal alum and gave money, which is always nice for any institution of higher learning. But the fact that this happened in the 1920s was very important, because this indeed was the decade that the Knights of Columbus launched its racial contribution to American society series, giving pride of place to a book about the Jews. This was the decade that the Ku Klux Klan grew greatly in number, achieved respectability and political visibility, shaping crusades against both Jews and Catholics. The quota system, which cropped up at colleges and universities around the United States, directed at Jewish students, also arose in the 1920s. So Catholic professional schools declared by virtue of their admissions policies that they didn't share this prevailing attitude of the Protestant elite universities. By doing so, they made a moral statement announcing that Catholics, and frankly, as Irish people, they didn't share in the hatred against the Jews seizing the Protestant nation. Their own history of persecution in the past, their experiences in the present as victims of Protestant American xenophobia made them more sensitive to the difficulties being endured by the Jews. So in these institutions created by and for Irish Catholics, the classrooms and laboratories and lecture halls and moot court chambers taught American Jewish young men, pushing them into the ranks of the successful American middle class. And they grew out of the assaults both groups endured in the 1920s. So I'm going to close with this example of how Irish Catholic professional schools made room for Jewish students. And I bring the story kind of full circle back to if it weren't for the Irish and the Jews. Recapitulating my words here, the Jews had much to gain by their encounter with the Irish, and so too in reverse. In this complicated encounter, both sides looked at each other across a set of otherwise powerful divides, seeing the possibility for mutual benefit. The benefit was for themselves, but in the process, it benefited the other as well. And in the process, as our two songwriters said, they helped make sure that there would be a democracy. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Dan Snydacker, and it is a real pleasure to be here tonight. I can't help but remembering the hour-long meetings I used to have with Ann Arnold's father in my office at the Newport Historical Society as he was beginning to think about the possibility of an Irish History Museum. He would be absolutely thrilled to see this crowd here tonight, as I am as well. Hasia, you've done just an amazing job at bringing a hidden part of our history to light. You presented a vivid picture of a lively, full-throated democracy in action, and showing that it works, that immigrant groups can work together. Who knew? To many, it seemed like the Irish, the Jews, and others wanted to replace the real Americans. You refer to this. I mean, who decides who the real American is? And why does any one group get to say that they're the real Americans? The idea that there is such a thing as a real American is a pernicious meme that periodically rises and falls in American society. We're in the middle of one of those upswings right now. It's usually used by an individual or a group trying to gin up irrational emotional support as they try to seize or maintain power. But the relationship you describe in your book has much more factual reality to it. The relationship that you describe between these two groups offers an alternate way of looking at the long-term issue of immigration. It describes resilient relationships that can absorb those ups and downs in American culture and stay together. This room is proof of that. In fact, this relationship was indispensable, as you say, to the formation of the American middle class. As you point out, their shared history points out the importance of allyship. You use that word. Whatever the motivation, and underscores I'm quoting from you now, it underscores the rarely acknowledged truth that no one, no group makes it on their own. In fact, this mutual support, this kind of relationship, this way of getting along offers a possible antidote to anti-Semitism, to anti-immigration in general. And your book comes out at a very timely moment. So, 2 questions that I have for you to start us off, and then I'll circulate with this microphone for questions from the field. 1, is this kind of relationship found between and among other groups in American culture? Do the Lithuanians and the Hungarians?
Okay, so on the one hand, I'd like to answer it, but I can't because I didn't study it. I mean, this is what I studied, but it is clearly in labor unions and in other kinds of settings where immigrants from different places had to learn to live together and had a common concern, a common goal to pursue. Those differences from back home had to be surmounted and were surmounted. I mean, I think probably one of the best examples is in the 1930s in the formation of the CIO and the Congress of Industrial Organizations, which was a pan-ethnic and indeed multiracial effort to say, we industrial laborers in auto, in rubber, in mining, in steel will never succeed unless we forget all those petty differences. Okay, those differences may matter to us at home. They may define who we want to marry, or may define what we eat, or what language we might speak. But when it comes to the workplace, we've got to get together. Okay, so I think the CIO is a good example. I do think, however, this was a pretty sui generis relationship. And Mayor Curley of Boston said when he sees that the Irish are losing numbers, okay, their percentage of the population was declining because of all the mass immigration from Eastern and Southern Europe. Okay, how are the Irish going to stay in City Hall and in the City Council and on the police force? And it's got to find allies. And he says, I'll take the Jews anytime over the Italians. And so now why? He said the Italians don't vote. They don't become, he says it much more colorfully than I could. He was Curly. He said, look, they don't become citizens. And if they don't become citizens, then they can't vote and they can't do anything for us. So therefore, it's the Jews who we're going to do everything for.
That's wonderful. So the second question that I have is maybe a topic for general discussion and for other parties, but what can we do to better teach this lesson in our schools, in the community, and to the state and to the nation, so that we don't drift off into these anti-immigrant episodes? How can we convince people that this is the heart of what it means to be a true American, is to get along? What about public schools? Could there be an initiative to take this mission into public schools in a more aggressive way than it's taught right now? I mean, do we call Ken Burns and have him do a book, a movie, a film based on your book? I don't know, but it's something we've got to address, because our kids, our politicians are ignorant of our history.
Yeah, so I mean, it's a very big question for which I can only say I hope there's a way. I mean, I'm a historian, but it does seem to me that one of the problems in general is we tend to think of history in kind of siloed manner. Here are the Italians, here are the Poles, here are the Jews, here are the Portuguese. and each one has a separate story, and there are usually no bridges from silo to silo. And it's a way in which now the field is organized, and and I can understand why it's organized that way, but it makes the story of any one immigrant population or ethnic population in subsequent generations only its story. And we know there is no only its story. Okay. And that, again, just using this one example of the Irish and the Jews, American Jewish history was shaped by other people. That doesn't mean they didn't shape their own history, but their history was shaped by those school teachers and by the, Johnny Ahern, who's pleading for the case of the kosher butchers. And for Michael Davitt, they made American Jewish history no less than Jews made American Jewish history.
What a great answer. We're in the midst of an election season in Newport, electing members to our school committee. And maybe we should ask the candidates, can they construct a course titled Bridges in a way that can rectify this situation? Okay, enough out of me. Questions from the field. Let me come and get to you. And when you state your question, if it's not audible, I'll repeat it for you.
You talked about labor unions, and how did the Triangle Shirtwaist Spire play into that with the Jews and the Irish?
Right. So, I mean, that's a great question. So, the victims of the fire were mostly Jewish and Italian women. But Leonora O'Reilly, who I mentioned before, was the one who went from one part of the city to another to speak to the upper middle class women who supported the Women's Trade Union League to come down and be with the women in the neighborhood. She was the one who goes to Al Smith and says to Al Smith, Tammany has to support labor legislation. Okay, until then, Tammany did not want that. It was Leonora O'Reilly who convinced essentially Tammany Hall to shift dramatically on its stance towards state regulation of labor conditions. Okay, so I mean, there's in a sense so much on the ground. In terms of that moment sparking a kind of political transformation of New York City. And really, Leonora O'Reilly, who nobody knows, really deserves a statue.
Thank you for such a dramatic and educational lecture. That was really great. I think you touched every point on the compass. One thing I wanted to mention, I've always been fascinated by the number of Irish American labor leaders and activists in Rhode Island, never mind other places. And it's all the more interesting because Ireland had no real labor unions until about 1900, because the British outlawed industrialization in the South, and that was a seedbed of unions. But back here in Rhode Island, the Providence Journal, which was the mouthpiece of the Yankee elite, used to become apoplectic by complaining about the English trade unionists in America who were teaching the Irish how to organize. And that's true. It was the English that taught the Irish how to do it, and they carried it on. But I just wondered if you had any comment on that.
Well, I think that's a very good example that, yeah, I mean, the earliest unions are founded by English, Welsh laborers, and they too, kind of like the Irish towards the Jews, recognized they couldn't sustain with this influx of Irish immigrants. They couldn't sustain whatever little gains they made unless they organized these newcomers. And what they thought of the newcomers is irrelevant. It's not about, do I like them? Do I not like them? What was relevant is we need them to get organized. And so too in the mines in where Irish and Welsh, where the Welsh labor leaders go out and tutor the Irish to do it. So it's exactly what Dan had said. No one's history is shaped only by itself. And I mean, the Irish contribution to the American labor movement is just unrivaled. And it's again, I think a story that most Americans don't know. I don't know how many Irish Americans know that, but it's really a remarkable contribution, as those two songwriters would have said, to fostering democracy.
Here we go. Like an auctioneer.
Okay.
I want to thank you so much for this presentation. To quote a movie quote, you had me at, if it wasn't for the Irish and the Jews. My husband and I are docents at the museum. And most times, sometime during our shift, which is usually on Sunday, we play that tape and we sing it.
Oh, wonderful. If I had known, I would have asked you to bring
So-
broadcast.
So if you've never visited our museum, I encourage you to come by, usually on a Sunday afternoon when we're in high holy season. And my disc jockey here will pull out the tape
Wonderful.
and we can sing along to If It Wasn't for the Irish and the Jews. And we can explain the Irish in Newport to you. So thank you again for your presentation.
Thank you.
Well, that's the fitting way to end a lovely evening. One of the unanswered questions that I have is about two, but I don't expect an answer tonight. One has to do with Tikkun Olam. You know, to what extent did Jewish religious beliefs contribute to their willingness and ability to listen to people teaching them about making the world a better place?
I mean, I think basically they needed it. I mean, they came to understand we need that labor organizing.
Yeah.
It's not an abstract principle. We need it because otherwise we're going to get burnt in those fires. We're going to be treated like slaves by our employers. We got to find a way to get out of this.
Right. And then the final question I have, given that Newport is the one of the epicenters of early American Judaism, there are Jews here in the 1650s and then again in the 1720s, a strong Jewish community here way before the Eastern European Jews came here. You mentioned that the Jews the later Jews, there were differences in class and outlook that complicated the robust assistance of the earlier Jews to the later Jews. And I suspect that's a subject for another book.
Right, although I'll just say very quickly, and again, it takes us back to the political machine, those Jewish social service agencies, which expended gazillions of dollars and did all sorts of great work. However, that money always came with strings. Why do you need it? They fill out a form. Tammany just gave it. They didn't ask any questions. Your kid wants shoes, you're getting shoes. I'm not going to ask, they don't ask. They didn't ask because again, it was so much in their interest that to get those shoes. And Big Tim Sullivan gave free shoes to every poor child in the New York public schools. He didn't ask, can your family afford shoes? Give it to them because every time that kid puts on his shoes, he'll think of Big Tim and he'll think of the machine. The Jewish, again, those Jewish charitable societies were, it is not a criticism of them. They did what they had to do, but it always came with qualifications and with a sense that there were such people as deserving and undeserving poor. Not to Tammany. If you had a vote, you're deserving.
Great note to end on. Thank you all very much.
And don't forget to come back to the book sales back there. I'm going to usher you right there now before gets diverted. Okay. Thank you all.